Okay, so now I'd like to welcome our next spotlight speaker, who is Heather Kharouba from the University of Ottawa. Heather is an associate professor of biology at the University of Ottawa, where she studies global change ecology. Heather earned her PhD at the University of British Columbia before completing her postdoc fellowship at the University of California, Davies. Her lab research focuses on how and why species are responding to global change and what those responses mean for ecological communities, with a particular focus on plant and insect interaction. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. So thanks for listening. Thanks for being here. It's fun to be part of this conference today. My talk is going to be on taking a slightly different or presenting slightly different context or different perspective to the other talks that have been going on this morning. So my lab, we're currently working on two projects that I'm going to be talking about today. And so we are thinking about the complexity of thinking about the role of non-native plants in the nectar diet of the monarch butterfly. And again, so I'm at the University of Ottawa, and that's where the research is based out of. Before I get going, I wanted to acknowledge the team that we have working on this. And so here are my co-authors and funding sources. So we are working with Dr. Greg Mitchell at the Canadian Wildlife Service. And then my students on the projects so far have been Zoe Pecos, Manon Veselovsky, and Dr. Steph Vivev. So again, I don't really have to tell this audience this, but we know that we live in a world of introduced species. So as we all know, we have European trees that live in Africa. We have African dung beetles that live in Australia. We have New Zealand snails in North America, and the list goes on and on and on. We know that. And so in terms of their number, we know the scale of biological invasions is staggering. And we also know that the frequency of these introductions is on the rise globally, which is leading to an increase in the interactions between native and non-native species. And so it is one of the biggest threats to biodiversity, but it is posing an interesting conundrum for some of our native species. So generally, which again is the focus of this conference, when we think about non-native species, we often think about the negative impacts, which have been really well documented. But not all introduced species become invasive, or in other words, have negative impacts. And so many plant species, for example, are imported as ornamentals, and they persist in gardens with our assistance, but they don't actually establish in less modified habitats. The fraction of introduced species that establish and spread is up for debate, but for some organisms, it can be quite high. So for example, half of the freshwater fish, mammal, and bird species introduced from Europe to North America have established populations, and more than half of them have become invasive. The sort of other flip of the coin, though, is that positive interactions are also possible. So we're getting more and more of these examples coming out, and we're finding out more of them. So for example, we now have evidence that non-native species are providing food, habitat, or even providing indirect benefits like habitat maintenance. So there's examples of non-native grasses that are suppressing the recruitment of woody plants, and so they're preserving grassland ecosystem structure. We have other examples where non-native species are acting as ecosystem engineers. So there's examples of non-native birds playing roles in seed dispersal. And so they're basically controlling how native plant communities are structured. We have examples in California where non-native plants are acting as host plants for the majority of native butterflies. So one potential positive role of non-natives that has been overlooked is the role of non-natives to act as nectar sources from native butterflies. So nectar is an essential resource for butterflies. It contains water, sugars, and amino acids. And so it provides all the energy needed for flight, and so it has effects on a butterfly's lifespan and fecundity. But again, the role of non-native plants in native butterflies' diets has been relatively underexplored. And so we don't have a good sense of how prevalent this is. I want to now introduce you to the situation of the conservation status of monarchs, which you're going to hear about more in the next talk. But just to sort of like really quick overview, I'm sure most of you know, but just to sort of reorient you, the eastern migratory monarch butterfly has declined by greater than 80% since we began monitoring it in 1994. And so as a result of the decline, monarchs are currently listed as species of special concern by Canada's Species at Risk Act. It is likely that they're going to be uplisted by the government and council to endangered, but as far as I know, this has not yet happened. And so again, technically in Canada, they are not yet considered endangered. But of course, they've undergone a lot of decline. And so we need to think about how to manage these populations. And so the main threats are basically in three different categories. So habitat loss, both in the United States and primarily in the overwintering grounds in Mexico, the declines of its host plant, the milkweed species or genus, and then finally climate change is increasingly considered a threat. It's having some negative impacts primarily in the United States. So to conserve the species, we really need to tackle each of these threats. So one way to do that, or one way to tackle habitat loss specifically, is through restoration. And so one of the recovery strategies that's currently being considered is the restoration of migratory staging habitat. And staging habitat in Ontario occurs in Southern Ontario. And so we do have quite a bit of it in Ontario. And so this habitat consists of roost trees, which is where the monarchs are resting between their migration periods. And as well, these areas include nectarine flowers that monarchs are using to fuel their migration that is really quite energetically expensive. So we really need to think about basically restoring these breeding grounds and the migratory staging habitats and thinking about improving the availability of host and nectar plants. So again, thinking about milkweed to increase its availability, but then also thinking about the availability of high quality nectar plants. So the basic or the sort of outstanding question over the overall question is, which plants should we actually use? And so we actually don't have a lot of work or a little idea about what nectar plants or nectar flowering species provide the greatest benefit to the monarch in terms of the energy acquisition of these different species. We also don't have a good idea of how much monarchs are using non-native plants for nectar. And if they are, if non-native nectar provides a similar nectar benefit to native wildflowers. So if they are using non-native nectar and it is of low quality, then that could lead to this developmental trap where butterflies are choosing monarchs are choosing a plant with low quality nectar, which could then negatively impact their growth and development, even their ability to migrate south in the fall. On the other hand, if the nectar from native plants is of similar or even better quality to native nectar, then we have to think about potentially our removal strategies. Generally, we have a strategy where we have complete removal of non-natives, and that's, of course, where non-native plants have clear negative impacts on native biodiversity. But the benefits of removing non-native plants might decrease if there's some native species that are relying on these plants as sources of food or habitat. So combine this knowledge is required to direct restoration activities, thinking about which native plants to use and to plant, and then when and where and which native plants we should be removing. And again, knowing when and where non-native plant removals will have negative impacts on native species is critical for thinking about how do we maximize our conservation benefits. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to talk about two projects that we are working on to get at these questions. And the first I'm going to talk about is the second question here is, how much are monarchs actually using non-native flowers? So we started to ask this question around Ottawa, which is where we're based. And so we wanted to first determine the usage of native and non-native flowers, but also considering how much they're available in the landscape around Ottawa. So last summer, we focused on the NCC Greenbelt around Ottawa, and we surveyed meadow sites. And so Zoe Pecos, who led the team, she surveyed monarchs and the flowering plants they were using on a weekly basis between June and September. And again, she focused on 10 sites in the Greenbelt. So the results are quite striking. So Zoe was able to observe 72 monarchs actually foraging. And so here are the sort of overall summary of what she found. And so 58% of all the foraging visits she found to flowers were on non-native flowers. And actually milkweed is included in this count. And so if you take out any of the observations to milkweed plants, that number goes up to 81%. So if they're not using milkweed plants, 81% of all the flowers were non-native. If we look at just the amount of, in terms of availability of non-native plants, in the meadow sites that we surveyed, 58% of all the plant species were non-native. So the majority, or even over the majority of plant species in these regions, are non-native. Right now, it looks like the degree to which the monarchs are using the non-native flowers is in proportion to the availability of non-native nectar. And so we have some preliminary results suggest that there is no preference towards non-native, that they are, again, using them in proportion to their availability. If we break that down by species, this is the ranking of the plant species in terms of the frequency of their usage over the entire season, and in terms of order of usage to the least usage. So the top 5 visited plant species are shown or highlighted, and the top one, as you can see, is the common milkweed. And then the next 4 visited plant species were all non-native. So they were the plumeless thistle, the field milk thistle, red clover, bull thistle, and tall white aster. So it's quite striking how many non-native species are being used by the monarch. We also have started to look at the seasonality, the patterns of this nectar usage over the summer. So here is looking at the floral area of these different plant species. So it's not how the monarch is using the plants, but it's just in terms of what flowers are available through the season. So this figure includes all observations of floral area, regardless of whether they were used by monarchs or not. So this would speak more to what's available for the entire butterfly community. So you can see here that there is this pattern where non-natives stay about stable through the season, whereas natives start out in terms of relative availability a bit lower than the non-natives, but then really there is an increasing availability of nectar, native nectar, through the season. And so after around July and August, we're really dominated here by a lot of goldenrods and asters. So that seasonality is interesting to think about. Again, non-native plant removal and where we should be planting native species, et cetera, which I'll talk a little bit more at the end of the talk. The sort of outline, or the sort of outstanding question is, okay, so monarchs are using a lot of non-native plants, but are these plants providing good quality nectar? Are they good sources? Or could these potentially be developmental traps? It's really interesting in the literature because there actually has not been a lot of work done on the quality of nectar between native and non-native plants. And so that's what we started to try and look at last summer. And just before I switch slides, so here's a picture of some of the common non-native plants that monarchs were using through the summer. So in the second question, in the second project, we focused on trying to figure out which are the plant species that are representing high quality nectar sources for the monarch. And we were specifically thinking about the fall migration. So Ottawa, as everybody knows, is located near the northern range edge of the monarch butterfly. And so to migrate south from Ottawa to their overwintering ground in Mexico, monarchs have to travel about 4,300 kilometers. And so to make this long journey, they have to go into reproductive diapause, which means they suspend all development of their reproductive organs. And so this generation of monarchs actually can live up to 9 months. And so it survives the winter on the fat stores it accumulates from feeding, starting from its journey in Ottawa through their journey south. So this is the generation we really wanted to focus on. And so Manon, my master's student, was the one who ran this part of the project, or this experiment. And so what she did was she ran an experiment where she reared adult monarchs on different plant species. So what she would do is she would introduce a single adult monarch into an enclosure with one plant species. And so she was able to successfully have 7 plant species. We had bigger, ambitious goals, but we ended up with 7 plant species. And so she conducted these experiments over a 7-day period. And this, again, we tried to aim it so that it focused on the migratory generation. So really, we're looking at end of August into mid-September. And she was able to track the weight change of these monarchs over for 58 adults. For the plant species that we use in this study, we picked species based on a review paper by Missoula et al. That's currently in review. And so they had looked at the flower usage by monarchs in public databases like iNaturalist. And so this means that the observations here, of course, there are some biases generally towards where people are found, generally towards urban environments. But this was a great database to start with. And so we specifically from this database, we chose late season flowers because again, we were focusing on the migratory generation and then also those plant species that were found to be heavily used in that database. And so here I'm going to start with my x-axis just to show you how we ranked our species. So, or which species we considered in the experiment. So on the left-hand side are the high-use plants, and then it decreases to low-use plants. And so on the left, we have Joe Pyeweed, then we had goldenrod, we had butterfly bush, white heath aster, purple coneflower, black-eyed Susan, and then oxeye sunflower. And again, it ranges or it's an order from usage from high to low. Then I'm going to show you, So we were able to have one non-native plant species in our mix this year. So our other non-native plant species didn't do so well in the greenhouse. And so we are I'll talk about it later. We have plans to redo the experiment. But in this experiment from last year, we were able to include one non-native plant. So here's our y-axis, and just to point out that we actually, adult monarchs actually lose weight over their adult period of time. So that's why their values of weight change here are negative. There's negative values between -10 and -50%. So at the top is lower weight loss and greater weight loss. And so when we wanted to look, when we were thinking about what are we going to expect to see, what do we expect to see based on our results, we predicted that plants that are higher use will have higher benefits. So in this case, they should have lower weight loss. And that's because, again, the idea is that monarchs should be using plants that have high benefit to them. And so again, we would expect to see lower weight loss with where plants are heavily used. So these are the results. So this is the scattering of all of our data across these 7 plant species. And again, the butterfly bush is in the middle, then the only non-native plant species we had.
Sorry, Heather, you just have about 2-3 minutes left.
Okay, thank you. So after accounting for, I'll just show you what the results look like after accounting for differences like sex, starting wing length, and other aspects of the experiment. We found no differences in across the native plant species, but we did find some differences between our non-native plant, the butterfly bush in the middle, with our natives here, so Solidago, and these other 2 species. So again, it didn't seem to be any meaningful differences between native species, but it looks like our non-native plant is actually lower quality than some of the native species. And also it doesn't look like there's any pattern in that usage, right? So there's no pattern depending on whether it's heavily used or not. So our initial results suggest that non-native nectar is playing a large role in the diet of monarchs. And at least right now, it's looking like the relative availability of nectar species may not be affecting fitness, because it looks like these are specifically for native species because they're not providing different nectar benefits. I would say we still don't have a clear picture of the nectar quality of non-native species because we were only able to include one non-native species in this experiment this year. But again, thinking ahead, for this following experiment, we are going to do a better job at including non-native nectar based on the lessons we learned last year. So we're going to have a few different non-native species, and we're going to look to see whether this matches up with which plants they're using most heavily in these meadow habitats that we surveyed last year. And just one quick slide to talk a little bit about some of the implications. So until we have this sort of final result about non-natives, I still would argue that we need to think about the seasonality of nectar availability and think about how we are ranking the non-native plants and their threat status, basically. So again, in terms of like widespread eradication of all non-native plants, potentially in these habitats, we may need to think about or rethink the perceived threat of early season non-native plant species and that non-native species, and that they might not actually be posing as big of a threat if they are providing nectar benefits to monarch butterflies. And so we may need to think about combining eradication efforts with supplemental plantings of native plants early in the season. And I don't have time to talk about my work in the Garry Oak, but just to say that this is not just an isolated pattern to around Ottawa, that we found similar issues around Victoria and British Columbia, but I'm happy to talk about that later, or otherwise if someone wants to reach out. So thanks for listening, and hopefully I left a little bit of time for questions.
Yeah, I can take like a minute just to ask you the highest ranked question on our little Q&A here. But I do want to say thank you for that really great presentation and for sharing your findings. Your project really does fit in with our broader theme of building resilient communities. So yeah, I'm going to go ahead and ask you this question here. So Patrick Kelly is asking, is it possible to compare the quality of nectar from different sources, or is there effectively no difference?
Can you repeat that last part?
Yep. 1 second here. Is it possible to compare the quality of nectar from different sources, or is there effectively no difference?
Well, so I'm not entirely sure of the question. So in the experiment we did last year, we did try and, oh, I see, maybe you mean directly compare nectar source. Yes, it is possible to actually directly consider and measure things like glucose and sucrose in the nectar, if that's what you mean. And so we are hoping to do that in our 2023 projects. To actually directly measure the nectar rather than just using Monarchs and their weight gain as an indicator of the quality of the nectar. So yes.